Good evening. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we meet and we learn from each other tonight on country. I'm coming to you from Gadigal land, where I live, work and write, and I pay my sincere respects to elders past, present and emerging, and I extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who are with us here tonight. Good evening and welcome to another episode of History Matters. My name is Rachel Franks and I'm the Coordinator of Scholarship at the State Library of New South Wales. And over the last couple of years, the team at the library have been collaborating with our colleagues at the Professional Historians Association of New South Wales and the Australian Capital Territory and at the Oral History Association of New South Wales to bring you fabulous lectures about all different types of history every month. Tonight, it is all about saltwater histories. So your host this evening is Associate Professor Anna Clark, and she's at the Australian Centre for Public History up at the University of Technology in Sydney. And in this week's absolutely shameless book plug, she is the author of The Catch, the story of fishing in Australia, which reflects her deep knowledge and also her interest as a keen fisherwoman. It is available in the library's online shop and we do free postage anywhere in Australia. So if you are keen to cast a line yourself after tonight's talk, you can catch up with Anna's work. Thanks so much, Anna.
Thanks so much, Rachel, for that lovely introduction and welcome to all of you who might be joining us tonight. I'd also like to acknowledge the country of Australia's First Peoples. We might be zooming in from variously today from all around, some of us in lockdown, some of us hopefully from fairer and warmer climes. It's especially apt to give this acknowledgement, I think, given that this is an event about environmental history and we are thinking about country as an archive and as a history keeper and history teller, if you like, tonight. It's a real pleasure to be here to talk about my two favourite subjects, or chair my two favourite subjects, history and saltwater. And I'd like to introduce the first of our two fabulous speakers tonight. Charlotte Jenkins is a fisheries manager with the New South Wales Department of Primary Industries and is currently working on the first shellfish reef restoration project in New South Wales, which aims to revive one of Australia's most impacted marine habitats. Welcome, Charlotte.
Thank you, Anna, and thank you, Rachel. And good evening, everyone. Well, before I start, I'll just get my presentation going to start. Hopefully you can see everything here. Just get things going here. Sorry, folks. Here we go. Before I start, I too would like to acknowledge the Arakwal people of the Bundjalung Nation as the traditional owners of this beautiful land on which I stand here today and pay my respect to their elders past, present and emerging. And please note the content advice here on the title slide for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander viewers. My presentation today is on behalf of our whole oyster reef restoration team, but I'd also like to acknowledge the work of environmental historian Dr. Jodie Frawley. Just over 3 years ago, the New South Wales Marine Estate Management Strategy was launched as a whole of government response to address the key threats and risks to the New South Wales marine estate, which is the coast and its sea. Under this strategy sits a dedicated project to deliver oyster reef restoration to the state of New South Wales, which is a new emerging ecosystem recovery technique to assist with enhancing fisheries and improving water quality. At the inception of the strategy, we were pretty much starting from scratch. There was almost no knowledge of where oyster or other shellfish reefs currently were, where they had been, or what we should be doing to manage them appropriately, even within the fisheries department. And the concept of restoring them was completely foreign. So we've been faced with a huge challenge to fill these knowledge gaps. And in the theme of our seminar here tonight, we have found that history really does matter. But let's get back to basics. What is an oyster reef? Well, similarly to coral reefs, they are complex, three-dimensional living structures. But shellfish reefs are formed by the natural tendency of shellfish, such as oysters and mussels, to aggregate or stick to one another. In New South Wales, we have 4 reef-forming oyster species. And this video here shows one of the lesser known species, which is called the leaf oyster, and it can actually grow as large as a dinner plate. So it can be really quite significant sized individuals. Now, oyster reefs or beds you might see in your local estuary could look like any number of these here on the screen. They could be high structures or low beds, or be associated with other estuarine habitats such as mangroves, or you can find them on sediment. They can be found in the intertidal zone, and so exposed at low tides, or in the subtidal zone beneath the water's surface. Oysters are not just a healthy, delicious appetizer. They are a little creature but can make a really big impact. And when they aggregate together, they are powerhouses of activity. Ecosystem engineers laying strong foundations which support healthy, productive estuaries. Oyster reefs provide a wide range of benefits which the community enjoy, which we call ecosystem services. And this infographic here depicts a couple of those. It can include things such as shoreline protection, where they can buffer wave energy and enhance sediment deposition. And also, importantly, water filtration. So oysters are filter feeding bivalves. They filter their preferred micro food particles from the water column and deposit the pellets of waste or pseudo feces onto the sea floor. So this natural process assists with nutrient cycling in the estuary and helps improve water clarity. So really do have a big impact. If we look a bit more closely at that water filtration quality, it is phenomenal. There's some studies that have been done on wild Sydney rock oysters that showed that an individual species could filter up to 2 litres of water an hour. So that's just one species, and imagine what a whole reef could do, which potentially has, thousands, if not millions of oysters. It's pretty incredible. Oyster reefs also provide really important habitat for a wide and diverse range of other marine creatures. They're literally fish factories, supporting many of our iconic estuarine, recreational and commercial fish species. Hopefully this video is playing for you, and you can see those beautiful brim there on a Sydney rock oyster reef. But where are our oyster reefs now? Well, you've seen some of the photos and videos so far in my talk tonight that we have some beautiful functioning oyster reefs in some of our estuaries here in New South Wales. However, global assessments have revealed the devastating loss of shellfish reefs, such as oyster reefs, across the world's ecoregions. And in fact, shellfish reefs are widely recognised as one of the world's most impacted marine ecosystems. They're just not widely spoken about. And at New South Wales scale, this is no different. To gain a better understanding of where shellfish reefs such as natural oyster beds once were in New South Wales, and importantly, what events have led to their demise and the scale of this, as part of our project, we've been taking a deep dive into the saltwater history of New South Wales. And I'll share some of that with you now today. So history indicates that shellfish reefs, including oyster and mussel beds, were once the significant dominant feature of many of our estuaries in New South Wales. It's widely known that shellfish provided an important sustainable source of protein for coastal Aboriginal communities for thousands of years before Europeans arrived, and that these beds also provided an important location for cultural gatherings. Some early accounts of middens provide an indication of the size and therefore the productivity of these beds, such as this 1895 journal article here, which describes a 20-foot high, several hundred feet long midden on North Creek in the Richmond River here on the north coast. But although the scale of consumption over time was significant, any cumulative impact by Aboriginal communities on the beds is thought to have been relatively benign. And in some regions, historical research has revealed their intimate knowledge of sea country created opportunities for some East Coast Aboriginal communities to actually work the oyster beds and enhance their productivity. So we delved into the early colonial history to see if we could help build a picture of what these natural beds perhaps looked like, and including in some instances, we can actually gain understanding what species they consisted of. So for example, here on the screen, we've got early diary extracts from the Endeavour voyage, the 1770 voyage. And these are perhaps the very first European accounts of shellfish in Australia. And they're in Botany Bay here in New South Wales. So here, John Hawksworth, the official record keeper, describes great quantities of oysters, mussels, cockles, and other shellfish on large flats of sand and mud. And Cook himself describes vast heaps of the largest oyster shells I ever saw. Interestingly, these oysters are probably native flat oysters or Ostrea angusi, and they are actually now locally extinct in Botany Bay. We've also been fortunate to unearth some really early surveyor maps that give a defined location for natural oyster beds in some of our rivers and estuaries. This map here shows the Hunter River, and we can see up towards the where the river flows out to the sea at the heads, there's a really large oyster bank, and then further upstream towards Fullerton Cove, there's a significant oyster bed depicted there on the map, which is just fantastic. Or likewise here, a clearly marked bed in the Richmond River. So there on North Creek, you can see that structure there defined as an oyster bed. So historical gold, as I like to call it, like this is unfortunately rare and is obviously dependent on the completeness of the historical record and actually being able to get hold of maps and so forth like this, and is dependent on the knowledge, expertise and interest of the surveyors at the time undertaking the work and for what reason the surveys were being conducted. Just saw an arrow fly in there. So the names of places can also provide historical evidence of productive oyster grounds. So names such as here in the Richmond Oyster Point, but other names such as Oyster Bay or Lake, Oyster Harbour, Shell Cove, and then other related names such as Lime Burners Creek, Lime Burners Cove. These all may be names that you've heard, or perhaps these names aren't used today, but they start to give us an indication of the colonial use of these oyster beds. And what was that use and what impact did it have on those reefs, on those natural beds? And again, this is where history can really help. So with European arrival came the growing need for a readily accessible and nutritious food source and infrastructure. And the natural oyster reefs provided both of these, a plentiful and familiar food source, which led to a boom in oyster saloons on virtually every street corner, but also a robust building material. With a lack of limestone quarries, the fledgling colony was literally built on the foundation of oysters. Early colonial buildings such as the first Government House, Hyde Park Barracks and Vaucluse House, the mortar of which is depicted there on the right, and some of these buildings obviously still survive today, were built using lime mortar or shelly mortar, which was produced from the burning of huge quantities of shells from both middens and once they were exhausted from the living oyster beds. Shipping records also give us an indication about how much of the early shipping activity was based around the transport of shells and or lime. And shells were either transported to a central lime kiln, such as those shown here on the slide. There's one on Cook's River there. Or they were literally burnt virtually on the spot in temporary pits. The burning of shells from beds of amazing size and depth to produce excellent lime is described here by W.C. Wentworth at the Hunter River in 1819, and then it was shipped for Sydney. The scale and pace of natural bed destruction was phenomenal. Oysters, unfortunately, were indiscriminately harvested by either dredging, which removed all sizes of oyster, or through the direct total removal of the reef, live and dead oysters, and importantly, the compacted oyster shell foundation upon which future oyster spat settlement relies. This back-breaking work was often carried out by convicts using what's called warp stakes. As the 1821 Principal Superintendent of Convicts, it's a fabulous title, describes, the men dig for the oyster shells in the bed of the river. The labour is severe in itself, and it is frequently performed when they are up to their waists in water. By the mid-1800s, the government of the day realised something had to be done, and the first regulation to manage the oyster beds was introduced. The 1868 Oyster Beds Act finally prohibited the burning of live oysters. And this is the clause here which introduces that new law. But irreparable damage had already been done. Only 10 years later, a royal commission to inquire into the best mode to improve and maintain the natural oyster beds of the colony was undertaken. And the commission received coast-wide reports on the state of the natural oyster beds, such as this one that came in from the Camden Haven from an inspector of oyster fisheries. In the 1860s, a man could work his warp stake into the bed and not leave that spot for 16 or 20 days, getting 10 to 15 bags a day all that time. And that for a long time, 10 to 12 or even 15 boats were so employed until only 3 or 4 bags could be got, when all left one after the other. Some came back in about 3 years, only to get at most 6 or 7 bags per day. So that gives a really strong indication of just how productive the beds had been, and then the serious decline. The Commission report clearly documented that the natural beds of the colony were in dire straits and needed better protection. A new bill sought to do just this, introducing new laws to protect the natural beds. And here's one of them here. But unfortunately for some estuaries, it was largely too late. The unsustainable high level of exploitation, along with excessive siltation of the estuaries, which is caused by land clearing in the upper catchment, and then the sediments wash down into the estuary can smother habitat. And this occurred as the colony expanded and, moved out of the Sydney region. And also the increased prevalence of oyster disease and pests. And this saw a almost complete collapse of the natural oyster reef system. So pretty significant, but fast forward over a century, and this is where history is helping us to gain a better understanding of what has been lost. And there's also new science and research is starting to quantify, to actually figure out this sheer scale of the impact of this loss to the community, to the coastal community. In recognition of this, in the last 2 decades, there's seen a growing global movement to restore these lost ecosystems and significantly recover the many benefits they once provided to coastal communities and bring back those ecosystem services I spoke about earlier, the water filtration, the habitat provision, and you have flow-on benefits there into tourism opportunities and the economy. The Northern Hemisphere has actually been leading the way in this. However, momentum is building here in Australia, which is fantastic, and now in New South Wales under the Marine Estate Management Strategy project. Through this project, we've worked with project partners and delivered the first large-scale shellfish reef restoration project in New South Wales, and that's taken place in the Port Stephens Great Lakes Marine Park. You can see here on the video clip some of the restoration works that went on there. So the project has restored 7.5 hectares of shellfish reef habitat. And I'm happy to report that so far, so good. We've done a very extensive monitoring and evaluation project of those works, and that's still going on. We're still doing that monitoring and evaluation. But the stage 1 reef bases, which were deployed in early 2020, recruited over 50 million baby oysters within just 9 months. And these babies were filtering a significant over 400,000 litres of water an hour. So just phenomenal. An important activity for our team, so we're not just doing on-ground works, we're doing a wide range of other activities too, but a really important activity in this novel restoration space is engaging with and educating the New South Wales coastal community, our stakeholders. The catastrophic collapse of the state's oyster reefs so early in colonial history has led to a phenomenon that some people call generational amnesia, whereby the oyster reefs have not only been lost from coastal ecosystems, but actually eradicated from human memory. And so here's where history also really matters. For why would the New South Wales community support the recovery of a habitat if you didn't know that it actually once naturally existed? The information we've gained from the saltwater histories help to fill this huge knowledge vacuum. So although we recognise that we now live, work, and we play in contemporary estuaries, we're finding that history can create a tangible story of something once vast and bountiful right on the coastal fringe. So for myself as a manager and other practitioners, we can take this story, we can package it up into various products and activities, and we can tailor that for very specific audiences. And through understanding this rich history of oyster reefs helps us better understand not only the scale of the loss, but also better engage local coastal communities in oyster reefs. And this important engagement is helping us to create momentum, support, and acceptance, or what's called social license, for the recovery of this incredible lost ecosystem. So I hope you've enjoyed the brief journey I've taken you on this evening into the saltwater history of New South Wales oyster reefs. It's very much a work in progress. We're still diving deep down into those archives. If there's any viewers online who know of any resources they'd like to share, please feel free to get in touch. My email's here on this slide. We've also got more information about the project. If you want to learn more about oyster reef restoration, there's lots of information on our project webpage, or you can follow the project and the marine estate management strategy itself on our Instagram. I'd just like to end my talk with a quote from Sir David Attenborough, a man I really admire, and I think it really neatly sums up the importance of saltwater history. So he said, "We expect less and less from our oceans because we have never known for ourselves what riches it once provided and what it could again." Thank you for listening, and thank you for inviting me to talk this evening.
Thank you for that fascinating talk, Charlotte. That was really amazing. We're going to hold off on questions until the end of both of the presentations. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce tonight our second speaker, Alessandro Antonello, who's a historian at Flinders University and works on the environmental and international histories of Antarctica and the world's oceans in the 20th and 21st centuries. Welcome, Sandro.
Good evening, everyone. Or I suppose it's still late afternoon. I hope you're all well. It's a pleasure to be joining you as well from Kaurna country here in Adelaide. So I'd like to extend my respects and acknowledge that the Kaurna people have never ceded their sovereignty, and it's a privilege to live in their country. So in the invitation to speak tonight, we were asked to reflect on how history as a discipline contributes to our understanding of marine environments. And so as a preface to my presentation, let me say that my current work is broadly concerned with how scientific and environmental thought and knowledges interact with the realm of international politics and diplomacy, and how that interaction shapes laws, treaties, ideas, and other relationships between humans and the ocean. My project before this had similar thematic concerns, but focused on Antarctica, the Southern Ocean and the cryosphere. So there's an overlap there with the Southern Ocean and the world oceans more generally. So to illuminate such a large field of inquiry as marine environmental history, I'm going to tell one story which concerns Antarctic krill. It's not just about krill, but also about the idea of abundance. Cultures of cornucopianism have animated the human relationship with oceans over centuries. These ideologies of abundance have contributed to the predicament we find ourselves in today: depleted and polluted oceans that are characterized by scarcity. Cod, tuna, pollock, orange roughy, sharks, whales, seals, and so on. Most species seemingly the shadows of their former selves, and as we just heard, oyster environments. And the global maritime proletariat is exploited and abused alongside non-human nature. Environmental history seems to most often tell a depressing story of declension or decline, and I think marine environmental history overwhelmingly exemplifies this declensionist path. But in telling such stories, we are hopefully excavating not only the specificities of what went wrong, but perhaps finding elements of hope, positive stories to hold on to. I'm not exactly sure I'm giving you a story of hope tonight, but I think there's an interesting element of renewal in the story I'm going to tell. So, to krill. In July 1968, a British whale biologist named Neil McIntosh made a big claim to an international conference of Antarctic biologists. Because of the enormous reduction in the Southern Ocean's whale populations, owing to the overharvesting in previous decades, he claimed that there was now a surplus, quote, a surplus of krill, Antarctic krill. McIntosh thought there might be, temporarily at least, between 100 and 150 million tonnes of krill for the taking. And some of his Soviet colleagues added voices of assent to his ideas. I should explain on the left. I should have warned you perhaps, but that is krill spilling out of a whale's stomach aboard a whaling vessel. Antarctic krill, or Euphausia superba, is the main zooplankton of the Southern Ocean. The current commonly accepted average standing stock figure is around 380 million tonnes. This biomass makes krill perhaps the largest wild animal on Earth collectively. An individual krill grows upwards of 6 centimetres and lives for several years, 4 or 5 years at least. They live in great swarms and are consumed by most higher members of the Antarctic ecosystem: whales, seals, penguins, birds, other fish. Although they are circumpolarly distributed, so throughout the whole Southern Ocean, the krill do tend to be in certain concentrations geographically. So the Antarctic Peninsula up to South Georgia, so that's in the sort of top left-hand corner of that map, are particularly rich in krill. So why was this krill surplus important or noteworthy? And why am I interested in its history and telling you this story? It is a slightly bonkers idea, which in retrospect really has not the best ecological science behind it. I suppose a creature of its time, but that's a retrospective judgment. Why it's interesting, I think, is it had a big effect. In the first place, 100 or 150 million tonnes is an astonishingly huge figure. I don't know how many of you are up to date with fish, fish statistics, but in 1968, 64 million tonnes of fish was taken from the ocean. Landings from ocean fisheries have never exceeded about 85 million tonnes. That's the official statistics. We could talk more about how those statistics might not be entirely accurate. In recent years, the global ocean fisheries catch has been around 80 million tonnes. Such a potentially huge fishery, that is krill, would fill what was seen as a global protein gap. There were worries that developing countries didn't have enough protein, and krill seemed like the perfect thing. Additionally, developed industrial countries were looking for feed for their industrialised chicken and pork agriculture, and protein from the sea also seemed valuable. And so 150 million tonnes of krill practically begged to be exploited. It helped as well that McIntosh was a fairly prominent scientist, and I'll describe a bit of his biography in a moment. So why did Neil McIntosh, tell the world that there was 150 million tonnes of surplus krill? And so let's break this down a bit. First, what was McIntosh's direct contact with krill? McIntosh was a member of the scientific staff of the Discovery Committee of the British Colonial Office. The Discovery Committee was established in 1923 to undertake research on whales and their oceanic environment in the area around the Falkland Islands dependencies, which is was a colonial territory proclaimed by Britain in 1908, South Georgia, amongst other South Atlantic sector subantarctic islands, and also included the Antarctic Peninsula. So it's really a good stretch of the Southern Ocean. This new research on whales was seen as essential to managing the rapidly growing whaling industry, which had commenced in the region after 1904. The scientific survey, so that's the Discovery Committee, was funded from royalties from the whaling industry itself. But it was concerned with preventing what was known at the time as the extermination of whales, a concern which really arose very swiftly after the industry began. So extermination was the word. It doesn't exactly mean extinction, something like commercial extinction. Here's the man himself. He was one of the earliest employees of the Discovery Committee. His first major assignment was between early 1925 and early 1928 at Grytviken on South Georgia, which is was the island's largest whaling station. That's the biological huts there in the middle. There, he and his colleagues took measurements and samples from the dead whales, which the Norwegian whalers brought in for rendering down to oil. The work was physically taxing, dangerous and dirty. The combination of the weather, the whale's viscera, and the tools of butchery combined to create a hazardous work environment, to say the least. This led to McIntosh's first large scientific work in 1929, which detailed many aspects of the physiology of blue and fin whales from 1,600 dead samples, which he had inspected himself, or mostly. Notably, this publication was the first to decisively demonstrate that the great baleen whales ate primarily, almost exclusively, krill. And this is where Neil McIntosh first met krill, undigested or semi-digested in the eviscerated whales. After his land-based work, McIntosh spent a great deal of time he spent a great deal of the 1930s, so that decade, at sea in the Southern Ocean. Aboard ship, krill were collected throughout the ocean. But really, it's interesting to note and worth noting that McIntosh wasn't coming into contact with a lot of krill, despite their size, really in the order of buckets of samples or nets worth of samples. Notably, it was during a period of 3 weeks of observation in early 1931, but McIntosh had what seems to be his most significant encounter with krill, with surface swarms of krill, which he relied on years later, so in the 60s. Krill are known to swarm and sometimes cover huge areas of the ocean's surface, so known to discolor the surface of the ocean. Though interestingly, scientists now say that swarms are actually rarely seen, and I think McIntosh only saw them once or twice. His last season in the Southern Ocean was 1937 to 1939. And had the Second World War not intervened, he may have gone south again, but as it happened, he never did field work in the Southern Ocean again. So we know that McIntosh had met krill in the guts of whales and at sea, though he began his life as a whale scientist, so he wasn't especially focused on krill. How was McIntosh thinking about krill after his final field season and when he was rather chained to his desk? His 1940s and 50s were mainly occupied thinking about whales. During the war, he helped to shape the post-war whaling order. He participated in the negotiation of the International Convention for the Regulation of Whaling, signed in 1946, which established the International Whaling Commission, which still exists and which had its first meeting in 1949. From 1949 to 1963. Despite scientific knowledge that the whale stocks were under severe pressure, the scientific committee had no real power to have whaling countries cease or moderate their efforts. And so in retrospect, we look back to the IWC of the 1950s as an abject failure. McIntosh began to think seriously about krill and its population size from the early 1960s. I think he did this for a couple of reasons. He had received some inquiries in the 1950s about the potential for a krill fishery, not many, but a few, at the time for what are known as unconventional fisheries. There were some institutional reasons too. In 1962, the major work on krill to emerge from the Discovery Committee's work was released, and I show it here a bit on the screen. This was James Marr's 400+ page The Natural History and Geography of Antarctic Krill, which is still quoted and even venerated in a little way today as the first great text on krill. It had been prepared, Marr's text had been prepared under Mackintosh's guidance, but Mackintosh wasn't altogether happy with its quality. It's worth also noting that Mackintosh and his British colleagues were finally being joined by a larger international scientific community working on Antarctica in the late 50s and 60s. Beforehand, the Discovery Committee was really the only organised and concerted scientific body or institution working in the Southern Ocean. At this pointy end of the story, I want to emphasise Mackintosh's mindset and my interpretation of it. Like so many aspects of environmental history and the history of science, there are rarely simple moments of calculation. Scientists or naturalists or officials are working in specific imaginative and epistemic contexts, not to mention the physical and material contexts, which I've alluded to in some ways. So apart from some basic maths, and it's not even that basic, why did Mackintosh, 1, think there was a krill surplus of astonishing size, and 2, announce his surplus theory to the world? First, and this is where the sort of stock photo there in the bottom right comes in, I argue that Mackintosh was dwelling in his archive. He had committed his whole career to one institution, the Discovery Committee, which had been swallowed into Britain's National Institute of Oceanography after the Second World War. He had personally collected tons of data, as had his colleagues. This data, along with voyage reports, specimens, and indeed his bodily experiences in the ocean, were the archive. From the 1950s, Mackintosh acted as if that archive was his personal property. He was very proprietorial. He even called it his personal data, despite it being government data. And that personal data, I think, made him see the Southern Ocean as a productive and abundant space, notwithstanding what he was seeing around him, which was the whaling catastrophe. And I think this personal data, this archive, centered him as the heroic scientific worker, the man who was intimately involved with the ocean, and the right person, one of very few really, who could and would and should interpret it. So here, abundance is personal, based in work and in the embodiment of a career in archives. There is a second element in my argument. You might wonder, why did he call, or imply certainly, but certainly call, for exploiting another marine resource when he had been so intimately connected to the catastrophe which was whaling in the 1950s? Well, Mackintosh was simultaneously sensing species recovery in the Southern Ocean. He had experienced firsthand the rebound of fur seals in the Antarctic, and through the reports and data of others, he was sensing the recovery of seals through his archive, through this data. Fur seals, to sort of very truncate this story, had been catastrophically exploited in the early 19th century. Millions had been wiped out in decades in Antarctica, from about 1800 to about, we can even date, 1819 to 1821, the South Shetland Islands were just, wiped out. In the 1930s, Mackintosh and his colleagues were trying to find, this is part of his time in the ocean, was trying to find the remnants of these seal colonies, and they were hard to find. Here, the image is them discovering in Bird Island, just next to South Georgia, in 1936, the first fur seals they'd seen in a long time. But in the 1950s, his colleagues were reporting a very quick rebound in the fur seal population at South Georgia. This was repeating what was happening in the Northern Hemisphere in the Bering Strait, which also had seen massive exploitation of fur seals, but was also seeing recovery. Recovery from, in this context, recovery from catastrophic overharvesting was possible. Mackintosh predicted that seals and later whales would rebound to pre-exploitation levels. And I think this profoundly coloured how he thought about the exploitation of krill as a possibility. why he thought he could conjure it up as a massive fishery and even encourage exploitation. Finally, what effects did Mackintosh's claim have in the long run? Like many of these big numbers, the krill surplus wasn't especially attributed to Mackintosh, but it was part of a larger moment. The Soviets started a krill fishery, followed by Japan and others from the late 1960s. This led to worries that any overharvesting of krill might lead to a collapse or damaging of the entire Antarctic marine ecosystem. Remembering that everything eats krill, so if you overexploit krill, you will affect everything. Attempting to address this problem, the nations who were signatories of the Antarctic Treaty negotiated a new agreement to regulate fisheries in the Southern Ocean and to protect the ecosystem, which they signed in 1980. And I've got a selection of this Convention on the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Resources here. Notably, even if it doesn't explicitly reference Mackintosh or other ideas of abundance, it does refer to the idea that any disturbance or exploitation in the Southern Ocean that goes too far should be reversible within 2 or 3 decades. I could go into the longer story, but it's interesting, I think, here to see Mackintosh's influence, since one of his colleagues was intimately involved with this negotiation. And for Mackintosh, I think really strongly saw that this 2 or 3 decade period was this kind of ideal period for recovery. He saw that it was possible to recover in that period, even despite significant exploitation. It's worth noting that the highest annual krill catch, so despite the 150 million tonne surplus idea, it's worth noting that the highest annual krill catch came in 1982 at just under 530,000 tonnes. So that's quite a bit less, to say the least. But the fishery still occurs, the krill fishery is still occurring, and it's expanding as we speak. And 2020 saw about 450,000 tonnes of krill caught. This is one of the larger crustacean fisheries in the world, but nowhere close yet to the largest fin fish, so regular fish fisheries. CAMLR has krill catch limits, which its members say they will abide by. The current limits are over 5 million tonnes for the whole Southern Ocean. Again, quite a bit less than what Mackintosh was suggesting. Here, just to put up some of my favourite images from the 1970s are krill sticks. I think krill sometimes get into fish sticks these days. That delightful ocean paste in the top right, which was marketed to the captive Soviet market. But today, really, krill often comes, though I encourage you not to buy them, krill oil tablets as part of the broader nutrition market that exists. So let me end with a very brief reflection. What happens when historians go to sea? Well, I didn't really go to sea to write this story, but well, in this case, it is with a bit of critique and a bit of skepticism that we can illuminate or even undermine bold claims about the ocean, especially its abundance, to uncover mechanisms of thinking and imagination about the ocean. And maybe to see that past actors weren't all blindly destructive, though in a sense they really were. Not that I want to be didactic, but decline, and I think in this story, decline and recovery go together in interesting ways. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Sandro. And also, Charlotte, if you want to put on your camera again now for some questions. They were 2 really distinct and diverse papers, but I think they also speak to a number of the common themes about natural bounty, extractive mentalities, and also, I guess, a fairly belated sense of conservation and some of the ethical obligations around that, as well as the importance and the challenges of environmental history in telling the story of our oceans. And I encourage all of our listeners to get up into the chat and ask questions. And while people are warming up their fingers on a cool winter's evening, I'm going to start with a little question for you both, which is one of the really interesting things I think about ocean histories is that there's a challenge there, I suppose, for the DPI as scientists, but also as historians, to tell a story that's underwater. You know, we can't look at it. It's not easy to see. It's not easy to see the decline, and it's also not easy to see that rehabilitation. How do we how do you both, I guess, convey that story, which for many of us is, you know, in another world?
I'll jump in there if you like, and that's a really, really great comment, Anna, and I think also throws up those challenges from those early, you know, maps and accounts too. Some of those reefs and beds were subtitled, so you know, even we haven't got the documents or the knowledge there of what once was there and what still is, and indeed today, you know, what is still subtitled in our estuaries. We are yet to jump in with GoPros and get amongst the toothy friends in our estuaries to check that out. But I think you know, really engaging the community in that when it is subtitled and underwater is a really challenging space. We're building a number of different products through the project, and doing some underwater drone mapping work, and doing some getting with some divers and doing some videos, but then also linking in with our recreational fishing community who, you know, go out and they might not necessarily see it, but they fish in and around these areas and they know where these kind of structures and habitats are. So kind of building a better picture that way. But yeah, it is certainly very, very hard. Technology is developing all the time, and we can use that a lot for habitat mapping and looking, you know, more at our seascape. You know, there's a lot that goes on kind of out there in the atmosphere and up into space. So I think there's equally, you know, really emerging fantastic technology that will help us discover more and engage more with the seabed and what's going on in our oceans.
It's a really good question, and I think as a historian, it's to emphasize that the historical actors we're talking about are as blind as us in a way when it comes to below the surface. I mean, you know, at no point in Mackintosh's career could he ever really see below the surface. It was all drawn, it was all inferred, it was all et cetera, I mean, I think some of the first video cameras used in the Southern Ocean around Antarctica only came in the late 60s as the very earliest. And, you know, those are minor visions of part, you know, a small part of the seabed. So I think in terms of telling the story of the discovery or engagement with the ocean, that I think that's a kind of narrative and even ethical kind of point of reflection, that to see below the surface actually involves certain violent eruptions, or, you know, not eruption as in, you know, going down to bring things up. I mean, the incredible violence of bringing a whale up to cut its, you know, to cut it open to see what's inside.
It's a crazy archive, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very violent act. You know, wrenching any number, and it's not just whales. I mean, to go throw a bit of concern to the smaller members of the marine ecosystem. You know, all manner of fish, being whatever, is you know, trawled up from the ecosystem, even by scientists. And that is a moment of violence, even if it does reveal. And so I think that's a way we can reflect on it and keep that in mind as historians in telling that story.
Mm-hmm. We've got a couple of questions from our audience. They're both for Charlotte at the moment. One of them is a question. One questioner asks, "What is the meaning of warp, as in a warp stake?" And the other one is to you, Charlotte. How are the oyster reefs actually restored? So if you could assist.
Great questions. Yeah, thank you for those who put those in. So yeah, the warp stake was literally a long pole that was used to drive into the reef and the bed and then lever off huge chunks of it. So there's accounts of some of the original those higher kind of profile beds that look, you know, similar to coral reefs, of some being 6 foot high, you know, and they would have been broken apart wholesale with these big long poles that they would use to lever off the chunks of the reef. So the warp part of the stake, to be honest, I'm not sure what they meant by that, and I have delved in and tried to find a definition of that, and
like a crowbar, maybe
haven't found it yet. Yeah, but longer.
Yeah.
They were really long, you know, so they could be on a boat, or, you know, they were working in sloppy kind of sediment environments. You know, that little extract there from the convicts working up to their waist in water, you know, it was sloppy, it was wet, so they needed big, strong tools to do the back-breaking work that they did. So yeah, that's the warp stake. And the other question about how to actually restore an oyster reef. So there's a few different methods, and we've been trialing different techniques in New South Wales, and globally there's some different techniques and research going on into those. Primarily the technique that's used really depends on why the oyster reefs are not naturally regenerating, and that comes down to two factors or a combination of those. So it could be what's called recruitment limited, so there just really isn't the wild oyster population base in the system anymore, or it could be substrate limited, which a substrate is the kind of preferred surface that oyster larvae floating around in the system will actually prefer to settle on and recruit to and grow and form an ecosystem. And so depending on if it's one of those kind of reasons why there aren't reefs there, or a combination of those, then will dictate what restoration effort goes on. And that could take the form of replacing that substrate, so actually putting a suitable surface down for oysters to recruit to. Often that's in the form of rock. Limestone in some countries. The Port Stephens project, we used a local more kind of granite based rock, and then some projects also use shell to attract the oysters, the spat, to those. And then where there's recruitment limitation, then it's kind of a more extra degree of intervention that's needed, and that's where we actually have to go and use a hatchery and go through a whole husbandry, kind of almost like oyster aquaculture style process to get some baby oysters, which will actually then be seeded onto the reef, either a suitable substrate that's already in the estuary, or we've laid down some substrate. So the idea is that over time they will reproduce and form a self-sustaining ecosystem. So it doesn't need to be kind of added to or directly managed. It just, kind of starts reproducing and bubbling away, and then the images I showed in my slides where they start to accrete together and all stick together. So
it's such an unusually good news story for fisheries.
It's great, and the fact, it's really, the momentum's growing, which is fantastic.
Sandra, we have a question for you from someone in the audience who's interested in krill oil as part of the health food movement. And is asking if you've given any thought to how this historical moment relates to sort of codfish oil and other health foods in relation to recent histories.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I have to admit that I don't know enough about the cod liver oil moment, or of course knowing it as a cultural reference, but not exactly what powered it. But how I will respond partly is that, in a sense, the exploitation of the Southern Ocean has often been tied to kind of, I don't want to say command and control, but sort of high-level discussions about global nutrition. Part of the reason whaling took off again, part of the reason whaling was renewed at an industrial scale in the early 20th century in Antarctica is because the technological change that allowed whale oil to be hydrogenated, et cetera, technical explanation, meant that it could be used for margarine. And of course, in the post-war, First World War era, deep concern that there was a lack of fats in the Western diet, that the Western, especially European worker wasn't getting enough fat. So this required whales or margarine. Whale oil wasn't the only oil used for that purpose. Let's say in the last 20 or 30 years, one of the elements of the use of Antarctic marine resources, including krill, is tied, I think, and additionally toothfish, is tied to the cleanliness of the Antarctic environment. This is a pure environment. It's not, but the standard kind of environmental arguments. And I just looked over, I've got Richard Flanagan's new book about salmon in Tasmania, which has a similar, well, he argues against it, of course, but that Tassal, etc., are drawing on the purity of their environment to justify the exploitation of a resource, even though it comes with environmental costs. So I think in the Antarctic case, it wasn't the case in the 70s, but let's say since the 90s, the purity of the Antarctic environment, I think, has been an important part of it, not just the nutritional quality of the marine resource itself. I'll have to look into cod liver oil.
We have to wrap it up in a couple of minutes, but I've got another question for you, Sandra, from a number of people in the chat are asking about the emotional connections of your historical figures to the environment that they're working in. What's their relationship to Antarctica? Is it sort of an attachment? Is it extractive? Is it how are they relating to the environment that they're working on, and how do we as historians in a different era, I guess, map and pay heed to that relationship that's kind of faithful, but also
it's a really good question. And I would say, I mean, the important thing I hope I got across about McIntosh, but applies to all his colleagues in the Discovery Committee, is they spent a lot of time in Antarctica. I mean, a modern scientist, if they're doing work on Antarctica, may indeed be spending a lot of time in Antarctica, but not, they're spending a few summer months, they're not spending long winters there, they're not spending years there. So for someone like McIntosh and his colleagues at the time, they were very present in the Antarctic, and reading through their voyage reports. Yeah, it's hard to, like many things in historical records, they're very dry. They don't give a lot up. Remembering as well that they're surrounded by thousands of Norwegian whalers. So for them, the Antarctic is a workplace. Like it is absolutely a workplace, which has, very poor OH&S. They have to learn a bit of Norwegian, even though they keep themselves separate as the scientists. This replicates a bit on board on the ships, classic story in the history of marine sciences, the sort of tension aboard ship between scientists and sailors. But yeah, I would say that for them, it's this space of work, which they spend many, many years in, like concerted years in. And of course, they have their attachments to it. Yeah, it's a really good question.
I'm going to have to leave it there, sadly. I've got in my run sheet that we have to wrap it up, but we've got a few more questions coming through. So hopefully, Charlotte, they'll get in touch with you about the oyster reef, and got some questions about what sort of oysters and how they're being used, and what is oyster farming and so on. So hopefully this is a way of engaging the public with this really fascinating project that seems quite a curious melding of science, fisheries science, and also history. So thank you for your amazing presentation, which was so clear for a lay audience. I really appreciate it. And thanks to you, Sandra, for an incredible story. It was just a fascinating account of, I guess, a part of the world that is, literally really difficult to get to. And the archive is very icy, I suppose. So it's doubly difficult to kind of read and understand as a piece of country. So thank you very much to both of our speakers tonight for their lovely presentations, and to all of you who are thinking of coming back again to the next History Matters event. It'll be on Wednesday the 6th of October on the theme of commissioned histories for all those out there who are interested. It'll be online via Zoom, and we really hope you can join us then, and you can find out more details about that next event via the Public History Professional Historians Association website, or the State Library website. So thank you so much to each of our presenters tonight, and thank you to the audience for joining us.